Hi everyone and welcome back. So if any of you have ever painted Chaos Space Marines before, I'm sure you're aware of how frustrating it can be with all that trim, the cables and all the little details in between. So in today's video, I'm going to show you my approach to painting World Eaters, specifically the Khorne Berserker sort of armour. So let's dive in. So as always, I like to break the model up into its sort of component parts and identify what's actually going to make up the bulk of the model. So obviously with this angry little Space Marine, it's going to be his armour. So to begin with, I'm going to prime the model black, and then I want to apply a sort of deep purple all over the model as a base coat, as this is actually going to provide the foundation for both the armour and the skin. Okay, so now to start building up the colour for the armour. I'm not going to be focusing on the armour trim. This is going to be like the body panels in between. I'm also going to be using a sponge for this and not a brush. Now bear in mind, this isn't any special sponge, it's literally some packing sponge that I got out of a sort of package I ordered a while ago. You can also just use your regular kitchen sponge. So I know a few people have actually shared this kind of sponging method before, but I actually wanted to show you that you can actually be quite sort of detailed with it. And effectively what you want to do is go from like a larger sponge, and then as you want to get more selective, you get smaller in size. That way you can be a little bit more precise, even though it's a very organic and quite a random way of applying paint, but it still doesn't mean we can't try to minimize that randomness a little bit. So I use a dark rich red for this first layer, and don't forget to remove a lot of the excess paint off of the sponge before you apply it to the model, as you'll just flood areas with paint and you won't get a decent texture build-up, which is what we want to happen. Now apply this quite liberally all over the areas that would catch some light, apart from those deep recesses and areas that would be in harsh shadow, which will remain that deep purple colour we base coated earlier. With that first layer of red down, it's time to jump up in value. So you now want to pick a brighter red and make sure the paint is thinned a little bit before removing the excess from the sponge. We do this because we want the paint layers to build up sort of gradually, and if you just put it on quite thick, yes, you'll get a lot of coverage quite quickly, but at the same time you'll probably get too much of a build up. So just thin the paint down as you would normally. You now want to start establishing where those highlights are going to start forming, and making sure not to completely cover those darker red and purple areas. Now for the final highlight, I mix a bright orange with the previous red colour at around a 1:1 ratio, because I don't want the colour value jump to be too severe and not realistic. Obviously this step is for those areas that will be reflecting light the most, and as you can see, I'm using a smaller piece of sponge for this, as you obviously have less control than a brush, but you can still increase your control by reducing the size of the sponge, as I mentioned earlier. Right, so that's the sponge work done. Now you can increase the highlight value more if you wish, but I'm quite happy with where it's at here. Now obviously this looks a little bit messy and not very polished, but there's actually another step to this. This is going to involve a sort of deep red contrast paint or speed paint, depending on what brand you're using. I'm going to be using Flesh Tearers Red by Citadel, or you can use any other dark red speed type paint at your disposal. You want to thin the contrast paint at around a 1:1 mix with water or contrast medium to really reduce its punch. And this is how I tend to use contrast and speed paints, as I find they're really good at behaving like a filter when you thin them quite significantly. Now you want to apply this thin paint all over the red armour, and as you can see, it has tied all those previous layers together really well and gives us a unified finish. The reason I like this technique for armour types like this is that you can build up that colour depth and texture really quickly. Once that has dried, you can go back in with a brush and re-establish those highlights with the sort of red and orange mix that we used previously. Now I tend to go back in to re-establish some of those highlights on those really prominent areas where it's going to really catch that light. So, on the very edges of like knee pads and very upward facing parts of the model. So that's the red armour done, and as you can see, that's actually the bulk of your model. But we're now going to go on to the bit where you need to be more precise, and that is the trim, and there's no way really of getting around it. There's obviously loads of different ways to approach this. So for my World Eaters, I preferred that sort of more classic gold bronze trim. So as always, I base coat all the trim areas with a nice dark brown, as this always provides a really good base to build up bronze and gold sort of colours with. Now obviously this is the squeaky bum time, because you don't want to get any of the following paint onto that red armour. But don't forget that if you do get any paint on the red armour, you can go back in with your reds and build up as you did earlier, but you will probably have to do that with the brush. And to start applying the metallics, I'm going to mix that same brown with a bronze at a 1:1 ratio. Once that is dried, you then start to highlight using pure bronze. For the final highlight, I like to mix gold and a bright silver at a 1:1 ratio for those brightest points on the armour trim. So from here, I like to darken and grime that trim a little bit, and for this I use Targor Raid Shade from Citadel. Now I think this is a fantastic shade when applied to bronze and gold details, as it helps tie everything together. Just remember, when using washes like this, to be careful about how much you apply at any one time, as you don't want it to pool excessively. Okay, so this next step is for those of you who are going to put helmets onto the models. So for the helmets, you've done the steps mentioned previously. So now we're just going to focus on doing those lenses. So to begin with, I mix a dark green with black at around 1:1. And this is going to be the base coat. Now if the lenses have any colour on them from the previous steps, base coat it black first. So now when you look at the lens, I'm going to use pure dark green from the mix we used previously. But I'm going to leave the very top quarter of the lens the black and green mix from before. So now we can see that there's a gradient forming on those lenses, even though it's quite subtle. So we want to start punching up a bit in the colour value. So to do this, halfway down the lens, we're going to go for a punchier green that has a lot more yellow in it. I'm going to glaze that all the way into the bottom corner of the lens. And for that final quarter of the lens, you want to mix that bright green with a pale yellow at around 1:1 and glaze that in. Once that's done, you should have a nice green transition. To finish it off, you can't have the lens without a light reflection, and this is simply done with a small dot of white in the darkest corner of the lens. So now that's all the armour and the lenses on those Marines done. But with the Berserkers, you can tell that there's mainly exposed arms and things like that, but this will also apply to faces. Now I've done a previous video on how I like to approach skin, and there's a few recipes in that you can use if you want to try more human skin tones, or a slightly non-human one in there as well. But for these Khorne Berserkers, I want to go for a more demonic sort of look. To do this, I'm going to base coat those skin areas with a dark purple. And to be honest, these areas should already be purple, but again, if you've got another colour on there by mistake, just touch it back up. From there, I like to apply a mid-grey with a slightly reddish undertone to the majority of the skin, avoiding those recesses. I then add a very light grey to the previous step, but again a 1:1 mix, and apply it to the areas of the skin that will be catching more light. Building up from there, I use pure light grey to spot and highlight the flesh. Like in some of the previous steps mentioned, I like to tie all this together, and I use AK Interactive Purple Deep Shade for this, which is a mid-purple wash. I thin this with water, again at around 1:1, and apply it all over the skin. Like with the red armour, if you feel you've lost too much of the highlights, you can go back with the light grey and re-establish them. And again, I tend to do this on very sharp points, so things like knuckles, cheekbones, foreheads, things like that, areas that are going to really reflect that light. So there you have it, that's how I approach painting World Eater's armour. Now all we've got to do is paint the weapons and leather details and things like that. I haven't included it because obviously if you guys want to paint them brown, you can paint them brown, and I went for black on mine. So yeah, the options are really yours, but I just wanted to focus on painting the armour itself. Now it's worth noting as well that with the steps I've taken here, you can actually apply that to various colour schemes. It's just about being careful about where you're placing those highlights, and like I said, use a smaller sponge as you go up. So the great thing with World Eaters is that you can now go to town as well with things like blood effects, because obviously blood god and all that jazz. And I mean, you can go like the full gore route, or you can actually just have them fresh onto the battlefield. I've decided to go a little bit more on the sort of gore side of it. But again, when you're doing blood effects and things like that, you want to be careful not to overdo it, because I find less is more. Just a little tip there. Now, before I go on to the reveal, I just wanted to tell you guys that I've actually started a Patreon where I'll be sharing details from my hobby table, and you'll get a glimpse of what's going to be coming up on YouTube before I actually upload it. And hopefully down the line, I'll be able to add more tiers and there'll be more benefits and things like that. But you know, for the time being, yeah, I'm just going to provide Patreon supporters the opportunity to have a glimpse into what I'm doing before you guys on YouTube. So if that interests you, there'll be a link in the description if you want to pop and have a look and help a guy out. So again, I'd like to thank you all for commenting and subscribing. You guys are great, and it's been really helpful as usual. It's really appreciated. So you guys are the best, and I can't wait to chat to you all in the comment section. So as always, thanks, and I'll see you guys in the next one.